Good evening. I'm Dr. Srinivas here, dermatologist with about 30 odd year experience. And today I'll be talking on phototherapy. Phototherapy has been one of my primary interests, and to some extent, I have sort of learnt it by myself in the initial stages because I didn't have anyone else from whom I could learn it. Uh, Today I will attempt to throw light on phototherapy. The reason why it is important is the Indian skin is different from the white skin or the Caucasian skin. Our skin of color, the dosage requirement and the schedule and the availability of sunlight in India is different from what it would be in the Western world. Phototherapy, of course, got its major recognition when Niels Reiberg Finsen got the Nobel Prize, the only Nobel Prize in dermatology, but he got it, of course, for treating lupus vulgaris and tuberculosis of the skin. The importance of sunlight was well known to us, even in the rishis knew well about it, the Surya Namaskar and other things, the importance of sun. They had predicted the seven, apart from that seven rays, they had predicted the presence of ultraviolet light as light which cannot be seen but can do harm to the skin was predicted by the rishis. History of phototherapy starts with Israel, wherein in the Dead Sea, which is 400 meters below the sea level, and possibly there is a fog over there, which filters off the light and sunlight, and is very popular for phototherapy. In addition, having a high salt content, you could easily float on it. You wouldn't easily drown. And of course, has got apart from high content of salt, it has got magnesium, calcium, sulfur, and this has been made. There have been made effort to use this salt for phototherapy with modest amount of success. Now, sunlight is about 5 billion years old. It has got plenty of hydrogen, which is getting converted to helium and giving light. I'm told that there is enough amount of hydrogen for another 5 billion years or so, after which that star will disappear. Don't know what will happen to Earth at that time. But having said that, sun emits a lot of light, of which ultraviolet light, which is of interest to us as dermatologists, accounts for just 5%. And of this, UVA is 95 to 98, and UVB is a still smaller percentage. Thus, the sun spectrum has got, you can see multiple waves over here, and that includes the X-rays, gamma ray, visible rays. Of interest to dermatologists is the ultraviolet light, the visible light, and the infrared, which is responsible for the heat. In the ultraviolet light, our main interest is ultraviolet B and A. Visible light is of interest to dermatologists, not so much from therapeutic point of view, unless you are giving it in some cases of maybe porphyrias or maybe in photo eruption, polymorphic light eruption. It is not of much interest in the therapeutic point. Of course, lasers, of course, have got visible rays and has got multiple. But from phototherapy point of view, as we understand, our main interest is in the both ultraviolet B and ultraviolet A. Ultraviolet B is a smaller wavelength, and as the ultraviolet light passes through the stratosphere, which is about 30 kilometers above the Earth, the ultraviolet C is totally filtered off, is totally removed, and only small amount of ultraviolet B and large amount of ultraviolet A reaches the Earth. Ultraviolet B is small, packs lot of energy, and most of the chromophores for ultraviolet B is there in the epidermis. And so most of the changes which we see in the epidermis is because of ultraviolet B, and it hardly crosses into the or hardly reaches the dermis. In contrast to this, ultraviolet A has got the longer wavelength, and it reaches right up to the dermis and is responsible for the various aging changes which we see because of ultraviolet A. Mechanism of action, a very simple mechanism of action is phototherapy acts very much like steroids without some of the major side effects of steroids. Is One simple way to remember, of course, it's much more complicated than that. And let us see as to how ultraviolet B acts. Ultraviolet B can be broadband UVB and narrowband UVB. I'll be discussing about that shortly. It forms pyrimidine dimers. There is peroxidation of the lipid membrane. There is Langerhans cell reduction, which is responsible for reduction in the contact dermatitis. For example, with DNCB or something, if you want to sensitize, if you expose a person to ultraviolet B, you may not be able to sensitize so easily. And then, of course, when there is alteration, it suppresses the cytokines, and then there is reduction of the Th17 factor. Its effect can be ultraviolet B's effect, can be acute, can be chronic. Acute, the commonest is, of course, sunburn. Sunburn happens to all people. It is not limited to white skinned people or the fair skinned people. Even when we go out into the sun, especially in areas which are not constantly exposed like the back, more so if you are wearing cloth and it is drenched with sweat, or if you go to one of the theme parks wherein the clothes are wet, through the wet clothes the light can pass very easily, and sunburns are seen, as well as tanning is seen very frequently in persons who go to the theme park or expose unusual amount of light. It is important for vitamin D, and ultraviolet B also causes thickening of the skin, which you can envisage or feel when you see a person on phototherapy when they have lesions over the dorsa of the hand. If you run your finger, you will find a leathery consistency of the deep pigmented skin, which indicates that there is some amount of thickening of the skin. Of course, most of the carcinogenesis is because of ultraviolet B, the basal cell, as well as the squamous, whatever. Malignant melanoma, of course, is doubtful. To understand phototherapy, we have to understand certain important terminologies like energy is described in terms of joules, power in joules per second, the amount of energy delivered per second is joules. Irradiance is the amount of energy delivered by a source. For example, sunlight, the earth that reaches is the irradiance, or the phototherapy bulb, the amount of light it delivers is the irradiance. And what reaches the skin is described in joules per centimeter square. So based on this, we have to calculate the time for exposure. Quite often, if we know the dose, knowing the dose of the sunscreen prescribed, using this formula, which is there in all the standard textbooks, and then it is incorporated in all the phototherapy units, you can calculate the exposure time. For example, if you want to give 5 joules, it is 5 joules into 1000 divided by 60 into the amount of irradiance, which we can measure using a photometer. The photometer, if you show it to the light, it will show you the amount of irradiance from the source. And using that irradiance, we can calculate the exposure time for this thing. As the irradiance decreases, the exposure time will increase. As the prescribed dose increases, the exposure time also will increase. Now, phototherapy by default means photochemotherapy. It used to be, but now, of course, we use it for both phototherapy and photochemotherapy. Photochemotherapy means obviously chemo comes in, a source that can absorb the light comes in, and the commonest source that is used, of course, is psoralen. Though kaolin and other such chemicals can also be used for absorbing the light, but they are not all that popular. This phototherapy can be like PUVA, that is Psoralen plus ultraviolet A, UVA1. It could be UVB, which could be broadband or narrowband. Broadband involves the whole structure, whereas narrowband is 39 to 311, much smaller range, which is the erythemogenic range that is required. And of course, we have the other unit like Excimer Laser and photodynamic. I won't be talking much about it. Psoralen, when we give the drug, it intercalates with the mono forms with the uh, pyrimidine salt, forms mono and bifunctional adduct, and reduces the synthesis of the DNA. This photochemotherapy, that is one where we require the psoralen, can be delivered in different ways. As I said, the sun, when you take psoralen and expose to the sunlight, it is PUVASOL. Sol stands for solar. You could deliver the psoralen by adding it to the bath water, then it is known as bath water. You could deliver it through a suit, then it is known as bath suit. You could deliver it through a turban on the head. It is known as turban PUVA. Turban PUVA. You could also dilute it in soap. You could mix it in soap and apply it and wash it off and expose to sunlight. I'll be discussing more about this in detail. It's known as which we call as soap PUVA, though it may not be an ideally soap. What we use is synthetic detergent, but can be called. And of course, the commonest is when we given orally. It could be with 8-mop or tri-mop. 8-mop is from plants, and tri-mop is the synthetic derivative. So when we give PUVA, we have to know what should be the starting dose, what is the increment, means how much are you going to increase, because what happens as we go on this thing, there occurs some amount of hardening on the skin, and if we go on giving to achieve the same effect, we have to go on pressing on the accelerator to get the same amount of effect. So we have to give increment. We cannot start off with one sitting and continue the same sitting like a fixed dose therapy. We have to go on increasing, because increasing doses is required to achieve the same amount. So what we do is in case of psoralen, so you can give the psoralen. After giving the psoralen, it takes 24 to 48 hours to get, psoralen gets absorbed after about 6 to 8 hours. Then you expose a person uh, uh, after 2 hours. After 2 hours after giving psoralen, you expose a person to the ultraviolet A light. So orally it is taken. After 2 hours, you expose a person to different amount of ultraviolet A light, zero point 0.5 joules, 1 joules, 1.5 joules, 2 joules. You go on increasing that. And then after 24 to 48 hours, that is when the erythema occurs, sometimes 48 to 72 hours also, is when erythema occurs following psoralen. That is the minimal phototoxic dose. So we know what is the minimal phototoxic dose, and based on that, we can expose the person to light, wherein we start with 1 joule, if the minimal phototoxic dose is something like 4, we can start with 75%. Based on that, we can give the increment. But in the Indian skin per se, it is very difficult to determine the minimal phototoxic dose. I have myself taken the psoralen, 30 milligrams of psoralen I had taken, and we had tried to determine the minimal erythema dose at Dundee when I had learned some amount of phototherapy from Dr. James Ferguson in the Brain Bell unit. And there we went up to 18 joules on my skin, and we could not determine the minimal phototoxic dose. So minimal phototoxic dose in our skin is based on the approximate. We start with something like 4 or 3.5, and every third sitting we give an increment of say 0.5 joules. What happens is this takes time. Over a period of time, the person has to spend a lot of time in the box. So when the person you find it is there about 15-20 minutes in the box, it becomes inconvenient. Then we can give a treatment break and once again start with a lower dose. But quite often what happens is patients themselves take a break and then they recome. At that time we can start with a lower dose. Whereas for minimal erythema dose for ultraviolet B, and this can be determined on the Indian skin, at least in 80 to 90% of the people we can determine, though it may sometimes go up to 1500 for in case of narrowband UVB, and up to 150, 200, 300 also in case of broadband UVB when you're trying to determine the minimal erythema dose. Here what we do is we wear a coat or a template, we call it, which have got multiple holes in it. And then each hole or each aperture will receive certain amount of light. All apertures will receive certain amount of light, and then one aperture is closed. Then all apertures will receive an additional amount of light, and second aperture will be closed. That way, one aperture will be closed one after other. That way, the first one will receive something maybe 15, and in the second amount may receive 30, 45, and so on. We go on. The higher dose, the each aperture will receive a higher dose of light. And then after 24 to 48 hours, we have to check as to where we get the erythema. And this is known as the minimal erythema dose. This minimal erythema dose is the minimal perceptible erythema. A study was done for a minimal well-defined erythema and minimal perceptible erythema between two group of people, persons who took the reading, and they found that there is a the well-defined, there was a lot of discordance. Some people felt that this is well-defined. Some people felt that it has to be more well-defined to be well-defined. But perceptible means what you perceive, what it begins. So that there was not much of a difference. So minimal perceptible dose is the one that is taken as the minimal erythema dose. And this can be determined both for the broadband and UVB. Broadband, of course, nowadays is not available. Narrowband is available. And even suberythemogenic dose of light is effective for the treatment. So it is always, it need not be erythemogenic, suberythemogenic, and we will discuss some publications with regard to the suberythemogenic. The advantage of using this narrowband UVB over broadband UVB is we can deliver much higher doses at the right amount of wavelength, which is most effective against psoriasis. So we can give 5 to 6 listings. For example, with broadband, based on minimal erythema dose, if we can give only about 175, here you can give up to 1000, 1075, or even 1750 millijoules. We can give much higher dose of narrowband UV. So what is the regimen when you are having the narrowband? Now, of course, that is the most popular one. When we started off, PUVA was the one that was most popular. Then broadband, PUVA and broadband were used. Then subsequently, the narrowband came in. So the narrowband is the one which you have to know first. So what we do is we determine the minimal erythema dose, and then we start off with 70% of. If it is 100, 70 we take. We take the minimal erythema dose, and subsequent exposure. Each time a person comes after 48 hours usually, we see if there is erythema, and if there is no erythema, we increase the dose by 20%. If there is minimal erythema, the minimal perceptible erythema, we can give the same dose. And if it is asymptomatic but well-defined erythema, then we can postpone until the next visit and then start off with a lower. For example, when you find that the whole skin is sort of red, when you touch, you find that the whole skin blanches and the person is also slightly symptomatic when he complains of burning, that means you have reached the dose of the erythemogenic dose and you want to lower to the dose. So you start off with a lower dose and then once again, you start increasing the dose. And then if there is a painful erythema, edema and all, then you want to stop it, the person recovers, and then start once again with a lower dose with smaller increments. Who are the persons who are likely to have the smaller dose? Who are the persons who are likely to? We had conducted a study wherein we found that the women in general seem to have a lower minimal erythema dose as compared to men. Men in the indoor occupation had seemed to have a lower erythema dose as compared to the men who were involved in the outdoor occupation. So when we are doing this, we start off, but then not many people are keen on spending time for determining the minimal erythema dose. I personally feel that it is a very good way because otherwise you start off with a fixed dose. It is likely that you can burn the skin, or you may start at a very low dose and you'll have to go on building, which of course is possible. And but then in such an instance, what you could do is for the Indian skin, you could start off with something like 330 to 400 millijoules. And it is very unlikely that a person is going to develop a burn. If the person is, of course, very, very fair or a female, maybe you want to go a little lower than that and treat them as type 3 skin. Then what is the treatment protocol? How often should you give them? Ideally, would be 3 times. But even 2 times studies have been found to be effective. It is better to get more frequent dose in the initial stages because as we go on giving the treatment, hardening occurs and the effectiveness becomes little less. So you try to get in as many initially. But then as I said, even twice has been because you have to consider the other things. Patient has to come for this. So there is a lot of inconvenience. There is a money involved in this. So you take the various other factors into consideration. And based on that, twice is the one which is the one which I use more frequently in my, and then you can give it twice weekly and then subsequently once weekly and then even 10 days 15 days. So like steroids, especially when you give a long time, as I told you, it is like steroids. This also is best tapered off. If you suddenly let a person drop, it is like a person climbing up the steps of a mountain to the hilltop, and then while coming down they come down by the step, they don't jump down. So jumping down or a sudden lowering can lead to quicker relapse. So as you are stepping down, if there is a relapse, if you find that the person is having aggravation, you can always step up and restart and give the dose rather than starting and stopping. But then again, sometimes the decision is not in your hand. Patients do tend to stop it abruptly and then they come back. And when they come back, you start from square one. The advantage of narrowband UVB is that we get a quicker clearance and it is relatively less erythemogenic. There is a longer remission period. It does not require psoralen. And because it does not require psoralen, especially in children whom we don't want to give below 12 years because the lens is not mature. So this can be given in children. It is safe in pregnancy, though I do try to avoid. But if it is a must, if it is very badly required, one can give it even during pregnancy. And then, of course, since psoralen is not involved, eye protection is not necessary. What will happen if a person misses the dose? It's very difficult to come regularly for treatment. Missing is not an exception but a rule. Patients are often not able to keep up their appointment. And when they do so, it could be because of wedding, it could be because of exams, it could be because of sickness. So whatever reason, when they drop out, we see that if they drop out for a short period, we can restart. If it is a longer period, sorry, we can start at the same dose. Whereas if the drop out is for a longer period, then we have to restart. And there is a table which tells you how to go about doing that. Then, of course, always 2 is better than 1, 3 is better than 2, as we see in dermatologic surgery, as in other conditions when you mix two different. We also see that when two different diseases join together, the severity of both often come down in most of the cases. Like MCTD, we find that when two diseases mix together, the disease severity seems to come down as compared to one. Likewise, when two drugs are mixed together, the side effects both can be given at a relatively lower dose, and side effects seem to be less, and effectiveness seem to be more. So we can give combination with various phototherapy. Phototherapy need not be a standalone treatment, though it does work as a standalone treatment. So what are the various? It could be with systemic drugs like methotrexate. Cyclosporin is questionable. Most people say no to cyclosporin, and even I have avoided cyclosporin. Though if it comes, shove comes to a push, I may go ahead. I will not be so strict on it if it is very badly required. It definitely goes well with retinoid, be it etretinate or be it acitretin. Repua is a very good treatment. And these things are becoming much more. Phototherapy is gaining much more importance now because of the COVID. Let us see. I will try to discuss something of relation, or maybe I'll forget. I can now itself tell as to what are the things as to precautions that we need to take about COVID and phototherapy. See, all the other drugs are much more dangerous to give, but narrowband UVB should be a relatively safer option to give during the COVID infection. Of course, we have to monitor the patient to ensure that they don't have fever or infection, sore throat, to ensure that they don't have anything there. And then, of course, they have to wear a mask, preferably a shield until they go inside the unit. The person, the thing, especially if they are going to take the dress and their attendant is going to go near them. All the social distancing precautions should be taken, but phototherapy can be continued during this pandemic. And same is not true for maybe for cyclosporin or for biologicals. I would hesitate. Even steroid, I would, of course, we are not going to give steroid for psoriasis, but for other conditions, I would hesitate. Of these, the relatively the safest treatment during this period will be the phototherapy. Retinoids are okay, but then there is some amount of concern with regard to the dryness of the respiratory tract, what effect it is going to have on that. We really don't know. Other, it has got no effect on the corona. So retinoids and PNB, NB-UVB should be okay treatment for the this period, and should be considered much more frequently than what was considered during the past before the pandemic. Then, of course, we could combine it with topical agent. Unfortunately, Anthralin is not available. Still, I feel it is a good drug, has its uses. Vitamin D analog, a lot of references are there for vitamin D analog that to say that the combination is there. But that could be because there are studies being conducted. Nowadays, nobody conducts study. Nobody is willing to do a study. If we do a study with anthralin and vitamin D analog, along with maybe topical steroid or whatever, I have a gut feeling that it may not be much different. But then there is not The present day pharmaceutical industries don't have a commitment towards anthralin, but definitely towards vitamin D analog. That commitment is there. Even tar has lost its charm. A lot of people say that tar is messy, this thing, but then you have to remember that we are Indians. And as Dr. Subhadan used to say, Indians don't mind messy treatment. Ayurvedic treatments are messy, and still many people opt for Ayurvedic treatment. So messiness is less of a concern for Indians as compared to the Western world. So we need not throw it out. I still use star for the treatment of my patient, and I find it to be quite effective. Indications of phototherapy, of course, you well know. Psoriasis should be the first, but vitiligo is the commonest, wherein we use it because for vitiligo, we have no other choice. For psoriasis, of course, we are spoiled for choice with many drugs which are equally ineffective. I'm just joking. Many drugs which are quite effective. Whereas for vitiligo, we don't have much of a choice. For atopic dermatitis, again, we have a lot of choice. But again, because of this pandemic, I would request you to give serious thought about treating your atopic dermatitis or your lichen planus patient, or even alopecia areata patient with phototherapy, especially during this pandemic. Then, of course, you know that diamond cuts diamond. So we can induce hardening using polymorphic light eruption. We can also induce natural hardening in case of polymorphic light eruption, which of course is using sunlight. I tell people to go out, especially you find that people who are not exposed to sunlight are the one who develop polymorphic light. So I ask them to walk out in the sunlight after they get improvement, and a regular walk in the sunlight. Walking is good, and they should walk at about say 7:38 at the time when ultraviolet B also starts creeping in. That is the time if they walk regularly, or at about 4 to 5 p.m. if they walk regularly, they can avoid polymorphic light eruption. Once you treat them and bring it down. The side effects, of course, everything comes with a price. When patient asks me, what are the side effects? I said, if anything you want that is got effect, it is going to have side effects. Nothing comes without a price, and then side effects are there is there for phototherapy, as it is there for any other treatment. Aging, I remember some of the persons whom I have treated, they age quite fast, so sometimes it does cause concern. But then on occasions like vitiligo and all, what choice have we? So, but then aging is sometimes you can even perceive it. You can see the person aging in front of you, especially when large areas on the face and other areas are being treated. Carcinogenesis is relatively less of a concern. Vitiligo skin seems to be somewhat resistant. It usually does not develop. There are only one or two reports of malignancy developing. And in the Indian skin, regularly for phototherapy, we have been doing, and we are not seen any malignancy. So when people ask me, I tell them that this can occur in the type 1 and type 2 skin, which is there in the West. And even in them, when they get psoriasis or they develop vitiligo, phototherapy is the treatment of choice in spite of the risk. So how do we give PUVASOL? Like whatever you say, at the end of the day, phototherapy, most of it is going to be PUVASOL because that is the one that is the cheapest, available at home. For vitiligo, how long can a person keep coming to the clinic, traveling, catching the bus, coming, beating the traffic? So sooner or later, you'll find it most of the person, they wind up doing the PUVASOL, that is using the sunlight as the source of energy. Should you be using sunlight, you should use it properly, otherwise your treatment is going to fail. So for using, when you're giving PUVASOL, a history becomes very important when you're treating the person. You'll have to see, is it a boy, is it a man, is it a woman? Do they have a rooftop where there is privacy, where a person can go to the sunlight or not? Does the man go for work in the morning at 7 a.m. and return at 7 p.m. when phototherapy is not possible? But even in that, if is his house nearby, or is he working from his house, in which event whether he can take a break and go? So you will have to go through his day to day or minute by minute or hour by hour activity throughout the day to see how you can slot in the phototherapy. Otherwise, it is no use telling that you take psoralen and after 2 hours expose and you write a prescription and the patient leaves, and it is not practical because you are not told them how to go about doing this the 2 hours thing. And this 2 hours also is very important. You have to explain to the patient that when they take it orally, it has to go through the mouth, through the esophagus, through the stomach, and then enter the intestine. And from the intestine, it has to reach the skin, where it is going to stay for half an hour to 45 minutes and then make its way back. Just as, for example, if you're coming from a nearby town, you're coming to the bus stand. From bus stand, you're coming to the main bus stand. From there, you're taking an auto or a taxi and then coming. Likewise, this also has to travel all that. So it takes time for it. Otherwise, what you'll find that persons will be taking and immediately exposing to sunlight. I've seen people taking one tablet in the morning, one tablet at night, and exposing to the sunlight whenever they want. So that is because we have not counseled them properly about how to take the medicine and after how much time they must expose to light. Now, uh, the 75% of the ultraviolet light which reaches the earth is between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. However, the maximum irradiance is during the solar time when the mid-afternoon. UVA having a longer wavelength reaches the earth earlier. UVA reaches the earth earlier and stays on till longer duration. Whereas UVB reaches much later at about 9:30, 10 is when the UVB seems to come in 10, 10:30, and then it is there till about 3:34. After that it drops. So when we are giving psoralen and phototherapy, we don't want to expose a person when UVB is there because it can cause sunburn. And also at that time, the infrared light also is much more. So infrared light is heat, and you know that it's very difficult in the summer to expose. So you expose a person to sunlight when UVA is max, UVB and infrared are the least. So this is what happens when the sun travels. It travels at an angle, the stratosphere. So you will find that it has to travel a long distance to the stratosphere, where much of the UVB is cut off and UVA reaches in the morning and night. Whereas because sun has to travel a shorter distance during the mid-afternoon, more amount of UVB reaches the earth. So distance of the sunlight between the sun and earth is much lower in the afternoon. Some people say that is, are we going to get sunburn if we go to the hill station? Yes, you're going to get sunburn when you're going to get to the hill station. It is very common that when people go to Ooty, they develop the sunburn. But it is not because you're going closer to the sun. The distance you go to the hill station and you're nearing the sun is a minuscule that makes hardly no difference. But what makes the difference is the amount of stratosphere that is available at a sea level and what is available from the hill station above is much reduced. And because stratosphere is reduced, the thickness of the stratosphere is reduced, more amount of ultraviolet light reaches the hill station. In addition, hill stations are often pollution is less, and because pollution is less, more amount of UVA or UVB will reach, and more so after rains. After rains, the pollution completely goes off, and you'll see that light becomes very bright. At the time, plenty of light reaches, and that is the time when a person is outside, sunburn is likely on a hill station. So, is there some way by which we can overcome the disadvantage? Because you know that in summer we get more amount of light from sunlight. In winter we get less amount of sunlight. When there is a cloud, it is going to cut away some amount of light. When thick cloud is there, it is going to cut away more amount of light. So, is there some way by which we can measure the amount of light reaching the earth irrespective of the season or the thing? So, this is a PMA 120 meter, which I had, but now it's broken down. But with this, I can deliver or I can record 4 joules if I put. It may take, I have got two different sensors for it for UVA and UVB. If I enter 4 joules during summer, this will happen in a period of say 10 minutes. Whereas in winter, it may take 15 minutes. But 4 joules has been recorded by this patient, and I will tell you how we used it for phototherapy. So as I said, the ideal time would be in the morning hours when UVB and UV infrared are not there and UVA is in adequate amount. The advantage, of course, of the sunlight is that it is inexpensive, no travel, but it has disadvantage. How does a lady expose to sunlight? So there is a lack of privacy. Then place people require either a rooftop or a garden where they can expose, and even if that is there, it's difficult for ladies. So to overcome that, we made this solarium. Solarium is an enclosure which is open above but has got a glass on the top. So through the glass, the ultraviolet B is cut off and will treat ultraviolet. So solarium treatment can be done throughout the day, anytime. Though infrared heat may be there, but because ultraviolet B is not there, the chances of burn is not there because of ultraviolet B. So uh, it will cut off the ultraviolet B and only ultraviolet A. And inside this, we published this article, Installation of Solarium. The initial first solarium in India was by Maharaja of Jamnagar in the city of Jamnagar. Of course, for tuberculosis and other conditions, it was there. So what we can do is we can have a bathtub inside the solarium, and we can deliver a bathwater phototherapy or bathwater PUVASOL, wherein the 8 mop is mixed with water, and then a person dips in that for 15 minutes and exposes to light. So this is what happens. There is a bathtub inside the solarium. Person enters the solarium, takes bath in the psoralen mixed water, and then lies down. And if we keep a PMA meter, and if I keep 4 joules near his, if I enter that 4 joules, in summer that 4 joules will get delivered in about 10 minutes. In winter, it may take 14 or 16 minutes, but nevertheless, the dose he will get will be constant. So thus, we have been able to deliver the same amount of light using sunlight in spite of the variation in the amount of ultraviolet A in the sunlight. And then we have been able to give privacy for the person, and we have been able to get rid of the UVB. Unfortunately, nowadays, of course, it has fallen into disuse because phototherapy units have become very common. But all this was added to the learning curve about the phototherapy. Then we realized that bath water is a fantastic treatment. It has got great advantage. Although some people claim that narrowband UVB is more effective than bathwater phototherapy, by my experience, I find that if you're going to list 1, 2, 3, 4, bathwater phototherapy is by far the most effective of all the phototherapy. The reason being there is hydration. When a person takes bath water, the scales are removed, and there is hydration, so there is more amount of penetration of light, and all this adds to the effectiveness of bath. But water is shortage is there, so we came up with this bath suit phototherapy, wherein water absorbing suit was used, and we added the psoralen to bucket of water in this concentration, 8 ml to 2 ml. We dip the suit, squeezed it dry, and asked the person to wear. Now the water is there on the skin from the suit, and the psoralen enters the skin, and we publish this as bath suit phototherapy. But the latest contribution of ours is soap. This idea is because what we do is we took different amount of 8 mop, and we mixed it with synthetic detergent solution. So 1 ml plus 19 ml, 1 in 20, 1 ml plus 40 ml, 39 ml in 1 in 40 solution. So we had different concentration of psoralen, and we also determined the minimal phototoxic dose using the different concentration. And we preferred a synthetic detergent as compared to moisturizing cream, which some people advocate because we found out in which it was most soluble. We found it in moisturizing cream or in water, it is not. In alcohol or acetone, it is, but that would evaporate and the concentration of the solution will decrease. But synthetic detergent has got a detergent, and it is a surfactant. And in the presence of that, this it becomes more visible, and psoralen mixes well with the psoralen does not dissolve well in water. That is the reason when we say that even when you give bathwater phototherapy, the water is mixed when the person comes. It should not be mixed and kept because psoralen would settle over there. And if a person lies down, much more amount of psoralen will come in direct contact with the back, and back is likely to burn, which is the reason why we agitate the water or mix it just before the person gets. Here we apply the soap in we increasing concentration. So first time we could start off with 1 in 80 or 1 in 60. Person applies it all over the affected area, and then after 10 minutes washes it off. So because it is in soap, separate soap is not required. We tell the person not to touch any other part of the body, and then immediately they can expose to the sunlight or to the phototherapy unit. And this is practical both for vitiligo as well as for psoriasis or for any other, even scleroderma, you could use this. So this is how we did it. We had found out the minimal erythema dose, minimal phototoxic dose with the various concentration which we were able to establish. But the approach is very simple. Start off with an increasing dilution, and with as time passes, rather than increasing the time of exposure, you can increase the concentration from 1 in 80 to 1 in 60 to 1 in 40 to 1 in 20 till you can go to need, and that way it is unlikely to develop a phototoxic blister. Not that it doesn't. And fortunately, because this is spread over a large area and because evaporation does not rapidly occur, leading to increased concentration in such area, even when repigmentation occurs following soap PUA, it is not as spotty as would be in the topical PUA, which we are more used to. So then, of course, there is a soap PUA wherein you can, for especially this for the hands and feet. Here you take two basins and you add water to that. You add psoralen solution, 1 ml for 1 ml for 2 liters. That is the approximate concentration. One for the foot, one for the hand. Person dips it while on the table is for the hand, and the feet is for the leg, and then exposes to light. But how is a person going to expose the feet to the leg? It is not possible for a person to raise the leg and show to the sunlight. So how is he going to do it? Very simple. After they show the hand, the person lies prone, keeps a pillow beneath his shin, and then lies down. And when he lies down, the sunlight will come in contact with uh, the soul will come in contact with the sunlight. I should have had a photo of that, but unfortunately I forgot. Then of course we can for alopecia, especially when you have totalis or universalis, we can go for turban pua, wherein everything is same like bath suit pua, wherein it is mixed and it is wrapped around the head. The only drawback is that as the hair grows, it cuts off the light. So unless you shave off what you have achieved, you cannot continue the phototherapy. So that itself is a self-limiting treatment with this. But this is one of the treatments which is worth a try when other treatments have failed. They also reported on this. Then, of course, I have already told you about the oral psoralen and how the settings can be there. We can give 25, 20 joules is considered the max because it takes too much time for a person inside the unit. So, PUA indications, which have been PUA there, of course, much before the NB-UVB came in. So, it is indicated in various conditions: psoriasis, vitiligo, atopic dermatitis, lichen planus. In those conditions where the pathogenesis is lower down, I find that PUA is more effective. Even in mycosis fungoides, I find in lichen planus, I find it is more effective. Not that narrowband doesn't work, the mechanism and the level of its action is different. But I do find that PUA is more effective. And PUA is like we should not shun away from PUA as compared to West. PUA has more, relatively much more role in the Indian skin than in the Western. Eyes need protection when you are giving psoralen. We have conducted some studies on that. But then nowadays there is some controversy whether it is required or not. Narrowband UVB, of course, as I said, it is safe. It can be given in children, in pregnancy. Uh, Combination treatment. What are the various combinations? We have PUA with acitretin known as re-PUA, wherein we start the acitretin before and then expose. I'll be discussing more about re-PUA because again, in this COVID era, re-PUA becomes very important. PUA plus methotrexate is a good combination wherein we can give the treatment. So, and then stop the methotrexate and continue with PUA. Or if the person cannot come, then we can withdraw the PUA depending on the individual convenience. And of course, topical we can do with calcipotriol. Tazarotene have not had much success. Calcipotriol should not be applied before light, can be applied after. It is used even in morphia. I have found good results, especially when a person, in case of scleroderma, depigmentation, hypopigmentation is common. In fact, many cases of scleroderma, wherein the induration of the skin is not so clear, will be diagnosed as a case of vitiligo. And many cases of this will come as itching of the scalp. And if you look, you will find the salt of pepper over there. Then you will find vitiligo like pigmentation over here. So in these cases, they respond very well to phototherapy, especially the depigmentation part, and even the induration part also will respond to phototherapy. LSCA, I have not had. Urticaria pigmentosa, I have tried in 2, 3 cases, but the patients were not very regular. I don't usually advocate it in granuloma. Then, of course, atopic dermatitis, I use it quite frequently. And in this COVID era, this will become again an important line of treatment. It gives very good improvement. And you will find that the requirement of topical steroid comes down significantly. And also, there's a sense of well being. Persons get good sleep with this. In addition, because the patient comes, has interaction with your staff, that also seems to help the person for the psyche and the confidence for whatever reason. But then you know that in atopic dermatitis, sweating can aggravate itching. So because of that, it is advisable to have an air conditioned unit, not during the COVID era, but post-COVID era or pre-COVID era, we used to have air conditioned unit for giving the phototherapy. Or else you can give a break PUA, like break. Like for example, if you have to give 7 joules, you can give 4 joules, then give an interval for about 10-15 minutes and give 3 joules more. UVA1, I'm not going to go into that. We don't have that. So the other indications for the light, of course, would be in case of pruritis, in all sort of like it seems to be the answer when you don't know when a person is not responding to any treatment. You give phototherapy, be it narrowband UVB. Of course, PUA itself can induce phototherapy. Broadband UVB was fantastic for the pruritis. In fact, it is a loss. The losing broadband is a disadvantage for India. Though it is in the interest of the Western world, broadband, if it was around, we would have still used it. Unfortunately, the bulbs are not available. So narrowband UVB is used for phototherapy, and it seems to work in almost, and even in intractable pruritis, it works. And what happens is, once it starts working, person starts responding to the other main line of treatment. So you're able to stop it, and the person seems to be comfortable. But it breaks that initial resistance to all the other treatments. Then, of course, as I said, it is effective in case of pruritis, narrowband UVB phototherapy. In mycosis fungoides, especially in the early stages, as I said, PUA would be my choice, or a combination of PUA and NB-UVB, wherein we have the advantage of both, would be a good idea. It acts by suppressing the Langerhans cells, which we know has got a major role in mycosis fungoides. It takes more number of sittings. And during the initial phase, so when a person is diagnosed as psoriasis or stage 1 mycosis fungoides, for the next 1 year, 2 years, you can prolong. But for phototherapy, they would have progressed much earlier. So it doesn't make the disease go, but it helps the prolong the inevitable. It takes long, and the person is comfortable for a longer duration when they are on this treatment. And then the stage comes when, of course, it is beyond our hand, and we pass on the patient to the oncologist. But I go up to phototherapy and methotrexate in my patients for this thing. And only when they don't respond to that do I send them for the. Then, of course, narrowband UVB and PUA treatment can be combined, as I said, and can be given individually also. Lichen planus is a fantastic treatment, but then it requires much more longer, more number of sessions. Though we conducted a study, we could not publish it, but then there are enough published evidence to show that in lichen planus, it goes. Of course, the pigmentation will not go. Even in pigmented LP also, in 1 or 2 cases, which was progressing very rapidly, where one patient did not want any oral medicine, I was able to give the narrowband UVB. Although the skin did darken a bit, the spreading of the lesion decreased in that case. But that was only in one case, otherwise not usually recommended. Side effects we already discussed. Turbo PUA is something which people ask because it sounds very nice, wherein we induce an artificial tan using dihydroxy acetone, and then expose the person to much higher dose of light, hoping that the higher dose of light will give. So it is sort of sort of targeted therapy over a large area of the body. Not as high as targeted, but nevertheless we give a much higher dose over a large area of the body. And another way is bad filter. You cut off one wavelength and expose. For example, if you use PABA, then you can that will cut off the UVB and only UVA will go in. This also has been tried, but then has not found much practical use. This is the band bars filter cream wherein they apply the cream and then expose to the light so that the light which is not needed is filtered off by the chemical. Then, of course, digital phototherapy is the latest advantage which has been tried. You can treat localized MF, which of course MF is rare, localized is going to be still rare. But then in those cases, we can give it this localized. I don't have any experience. This is from the literature. And thanks to Satish Pai who has shared this slide with me. These are the results. Then methotrexate narrowband UVB phototherapy versus narrowband alone, we found that combination gives a better result and either one of can be withdrawn once improvement. In pediatric, in children, there is not much difference. We can give comfortably phototherapy provided, of course, the children can stand in the unit. It is better that you give front and back separately rather than in the closed unit because children may feel claustrophobic and we do not know. And if you are using narrowband UVB for with the open panel, then nobody else should be around, or if somebody else is around, they should protect themselves well, inclusive of their eyes and their body. Then psoralen plus UVB, narrowband plus NB-UVB, we have taken PUVB and narrowband UVB has been found to be effective in some. But when we conducted a study wherein we conducted with the PNB-UVB, NB-UVB and psoralen plus NB-UVB, and we did not find. We found that narrowband UVB was nearly as effective even when psoralen was compared, and the statistically result was not different. There was some amount of more improvement when psoralen was mixed, but it was not statistically significant. Then patients with vitiligo who have lesions on the face, we know that persons with the darker skin, face and all, they respond better to phototherapy in vitiligo and to narrowband. Then, of course, we have twice weekly. Then they found that twice weekly is nearly as effective as thrice weekly. Then in nodular prurigo, so I find it an effective treatment in case of prurigo, wherein we can give thalidomide and phototherapy, and the person improves, we can remove the thalidomide and give, or we can give intralesional steroids and phototherapy in these cases, along with tricyclic antidepressants or whatever else you use, because these are very difficult treatments to case. But then you find that once they start improving, then they start. Initially, they refuse to show any improvement for the first 6 to 8 months. But once they get onto the improvement cycle, we find that many of them do improve. Then, of course, as I said, salt water has been tried, balinotherapy has been tried, but then there's a lot of concern because the salt, especially when used in the Dead Sea level concentration, Dead Sea salts are available, but that salt has to be liberated outside, and there is a pollution uh, consideration with regard to that. It has been tried. There are some adventurous people who have tried it even for pustular psoriasis. I haven't. Then, as I said, we go on giving increment 20%, 30%. But then even lower increments have been found to be effective, which is why they say sub-erythemogenic. And this may be of much more importance in India because the erythema does not show. So sub-erythemogenic to some extent may be erythemogenic in many cases. Then psoralen plus UVB, UVA and narrowband UVB for the treatment of lichen planus has been found to be effective. Scleroderma is one of the fantastic conditions where we can treat. Much more is when the person have got localized morphia, localized scleroderma. I give them soap PUA. I find that it's a very fantastic treatment. Soap PUA in those cases. Or you could even dip a piece of cloth in the psoralen solution, keep it at that side, a modified sort of bath suit PUVA or turban PUVA, and expose them, and you find that the person improves. Then, of course, acitretin has been found. Multiple studies are there with regard to acitretin. You could have a tapering dose or a fixed tapering dose of acitretin is effective in the treatment of psoriasis, and it can be combined with acitretin. When combined with, we get a much better result both with PUA as well as broadband and narrowband. The rationale for combining is that clearance time is much less. The irradiation exposure, total exposure a person gets is significantly reduced, and remissions also seem to last much longer. So acitretin can be given as a low dose, and then, but then with a higher dose, we get a still better result. We can pump up the dose of acitretin, but then of course acitretin has got its own side effects, which we have to follow. If a person has got, you have to check his lipid profile very regularly when a person is on that. Not very safe in children. Of course, with female, we cannot give it, or even if we give it for the next 4 years, a person should not be uh, conceiving if acitretin is given. Though etretinate was the one which is considered much more dangerous, but then it is always possible that some sort of alcohol can enter. But then they say that that is basically avoided for the next 3 to 4 months. If during that period, if you are able to avoid alcohol, that is enough. Alcoholic, like cough syrup or something, one should be careful about it. Of course, plain alcohol is not permitted in them. Uh, so that has to be watched out. So it is better to avoid it in the women of the childbearing age. So a low dose is given about 15 to 20 days before we start the phototherapy, and then we expose the person to light. Then, of course, we have the lasers. We have the Excimer lasers. I'm not going to go too much into that because I don't have that, nor do I have any personal experience. But then the advantage, this is the one which I have, is an Excimer light, which we can treat smaller areas. And for this, it is advisable that one determines the minimal erythema dose and then gives the treatment. This is the comb which is there comes with that. So it is very easy to determine the minimal erythema dose. And then for this, you start with either half MED, 1 MED, then 2 MED. Every time you can give 1 MED increment because you want to push in. So here the idea is give a high dose in a small area and get results. Can be used when small areas are involved in this case. We did some experiment using sort of targeted where we use the comb to give a much wider area to see if from that area we are able to induce the pigmentation in that. So this is the minimal erythema dose using the comb of the uh, targeted light, wherein we can get multiple spots we can see. This is the regular one. We can see that at 300 it has started. Usually in Indian skin, if it starts at 300, that means the MED would be, actual MED might be even at 200 or even lower. So you have to be careful with that. These are the results we got. And we have also treated alopecia areata with targeted light. Of course, one can even achieve this without this with any other treatment or can occur by itself. So once it doesn't make it, but then we did treat this person and the child showed significant improvement. So starting joules, we gave 100 millijoules, and it took quite some time for the improvement. So today I have talked about phototherapy. This is the sun god, and below that you can see the 7 horses of the sun god representing the Vindhyar, and of course his 2 girlfriends around. So yes, phototherapy has been it's one of the my favorite subjects. I love phototherapy, and I have used it extensively. And for some time now, with newer drugs coming for psoriasis, with biologics and all that, phototherapy was losing some amount of ground. And unfortunately, not too much new advances have been made in the field of phototherapy, unless we consider all the lasers as a part of phototherapy. But phototherapy, as we understand, not too much, except the LED lights are the only new advances. Maybe some breakthrough will occur. But phototherapy, especially in this time of COVID, uh, is very relevant. Hope this talk is of was useful to you. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed.